Hi, I'm Susan Navarre from the Fitchburg Historical Society, and welcome to I Remember When. In this episode, we will be looking at music written specifically for Fitchburg.
It was big, and by that I mean I reflected at the time and since that was and probably will remain the largest audience my music has been played for. So the number of people at the Bernardian Bowl outside, and that was unusual for me. And at that time, much, not all, but much of my work was sort of in the more rarefied contemporary classical world, and I still exist in that world, but I do a lot of things for much smaller audiences, and it was quite a change.
One of the recurring themes of Fitchburg history is that it was important as a manufacturing center very early in the Industrial Revolution, which meant that it was generally a thriving community during the 1800s. As a result, it participated in most of the cultural and entertainment opportunities of its time, such as the publication of news and literature, art exhibitions, the circus, the theater, and music. In Fitchburg's early years, social life revolved around the churches, and most of the city's music was religious. Fitchburg was large enough that it would have a piano factory by 1850, and many theaters would dot Main Street by the end of the century. By the turn of the century in 1900, local leaders were coming together to create a Fitchburg Symphony Orchestra, to bring together all the many different musical performers and audience members who were active in the city at the time. Barbara White's Fitchburg Commission was part of a national millennium celebration called Continental Harmony. It was spearheaded by the White House Millennium Council from Washington, D.C. Their theme for the year 2000 in the U.S. was Honor the Past, Imagine the Future. In this case, the National Endowment for the Arts and the American Composers Forum were making it possible for American composers to write new music in all 50 states. The Fitchburg Project was the only one chosen in Massachusetts. The Fitchburg Historical Society was part of the group that came up with the project.
And that was just at the beginning of revitalization, cities revitalization being linked to the arts and culture sector. Not only was it the only one in the state of Massachusetts, but Patricia Schifford, who was the head of the program, came to the opening, came to the premiere. Continental Harmony put out this application that said, basically in a nutshell, if you could bring a composer to your city, what would they compose and who would be involved? And we just imagined what could be. I mean, we knew two major things. We had the Thayer Symphony Orchestra.
Yeah, I see, yes.
They always did a 4th of July concert and fireworks at the Bernardian Bowl. The high school band always marched on Main Street on July 4th. We already had a coalition of downtown development, which was Fitchburg by Design, the arts community, the university, although we were the college at that point. And when I was hired at Fitchburg State, which I wish I could tell you when that was, Dan Flynn, I reported to Dan Flynn. He was the vice president of development, and they really truly wanted to use my position as a way to invite the community up to the college, right? That was just the beginning of the change in North Street, and that whole really concerted effort by the university to welcome Fitchburg, the city of Fitchburg, to the university and change that notion of the glass wall that existed, of the brick wall, truly.
Yeah.
And also, that started the reclaiming of North Street,
Mhm.
which was not a good street when I first came.
Barbara White was a composer in the music department at Princeton University in New Jersey. When she was commissioned to write this piece for Fitchburg, the committee had heard an earlier work that they admired that she had written as a remembrance of the Johnstown flood, an 1889 tragedy that still resides in the national consciousness. She came to the city for a 4-week residency to get a sense of the city's history, culture, and future hopes. This piece of music was made to be a celebration of the city's robust musical heritage, especially since every ethnic group in the city had brought their music to Fitchburg. Fitchburg had choral groups, musical theater, dance troupes, dance bands, brass bands, and marching bands. Some of that tradition still continues with the school bands, the Fitchburg Military Band, and the Fitchburg City Band.
She understood how the physical environment, because Fitchburg was so, who Fitchburg was determined by its physical landscape, right? I mean, the river and the hills absolutely informed the city
Yeah.
and how the city developed. And she understood that the physical environs informed the city. And that's why she starts out with the glacier. That's why she starts out with the river being formed, and then the immigrants and the human population coming. I mean, that, and you could hear that in her, in the Johnstown flood. She understood that connection of human, of peoples and the environment.
Hi, I'm Dr. Amy McGlothlin. I'm a professor at Fitchburg State University in the music area of the Humanities Department. And I am here today with Barbara White, who is a composer that wrote a piece for the city of Fitchburg about 20 years ago. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks. How are you, Amy?
I'm great. Thanks for joining us. So how about a little bit of information about this composition and how it originated for the city of Fitchburg?
The piece was written for the occasion of the millennium as part of a program called Continental Harmony, which was run by the American Composers Forum. And a commission was done in each state. So there were 50 commissions. And within each state, organizations applied to be the recipients of the commission. Fitchburg was represented by Reach Fitchburg and came up with a proposal and was awarded the Massachusetts commission. And then I was matched up, I requested to work on that one, partly because Massachusetts is my home state and I was interested in coming back and working on something that had to do with the community and the history and so on.
That's really fascinating that the city of Fitchburg was chosen for this, because it is such a small city in comparison to some of the other cities in our state that have more notoriety, such as Boston or Cambridge or even Worcester.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very exciting that a smaller city such as Fitchburg was awarded this opportunity. What part of Massachusetts are you from?
I grew up in North Reading, Massachusetts. It happens that I grew up about 1,000 feet from the gravestone of George F. Root, another historic composer from the Civil War period. So when I was working on the commission for Fitchburg, I was also aware of that history and how much of it is there, but we don't necessarily engage with it or see it that often.
Right. Had you ever been to Fitchburg prior to receiving this commission?
Oh, that's a good question. I think I had some as a kid. I think probably the closest that I went often was Whalum Park, which was in Lunenburg. Have I got that right?
That's correct. It was right next door.
Mm-hmm. So I went there often as a kid, maybe some to Fitchburg.
Yeah, sadly, Whalen Park no longer exists, and
Mhm.
it's a condo development now. But
Oh,
the lake is still there, and there is actually still a driving range, a golf driving range right next door to that that I believe was part of that park before. But
I see. One of the things I uncovered in the archives in the Historical Society, the Fitchburg Historical Society, was a publication of the Whalen Park waltzes. So that was another piece of history from the area.
oh wow, that's fascinating. So, when you were writing the piece, you visited Fitchburg several times, correctly,
Right.
and got to know some of the cultural groups in the city. What sort of things did they tell you about the city and its past?
Yeah. I think one of the first things I heard about was the boulder, which played a big part in our discussions and also in my composition. And the industrial history was brought up a lot. I had the opportunity to look at Doris Kirkpatrick's book, The City and the River, so that filled in some of my understanding at the time about the area, the industry, and so on. And through working at the Historical Society, I found a lot about the music of the area. In fragments, let's say. So I found a lot of different materials that gave me some inkling of what might have happened musically over a period of time. And that was a treasure trove of materials. I had no idea that I would end up looking at pieces from 1796 or a march from the late 19th century and so on. So that was a big discovery.
So, did you know that your piece was continuing to be used for a local public access TV show inside Fitchburg? So, did you know that your piece was continuing to be used for a local public access TV show inside Fitchburg?
Yes, I did know. I'm chuckling because that sounds almost like I could have been kept in the dark or something like that. I'm not sure I knew right at the beginning, but some of the people from the project were very kind about keeping in touch. So I've mentioned Mary Chapin Durling for sure, and I remember that Ken Jones contacted me to tell me about that. So I was pleased to hear that it was being used. And I think at the time, I don't know if I could have seen it on the internet, but now, I can go look up and see how they're using the piece, which is nice.
So, after the Industrial Revolution had kind of passed and we get to mid century Fitchburg, a lot of the manufacturing kind of moved out of the city, and the city has frankly been struggling economically ever since then. Did you have any preconceptions about the city that may have been changed by your experiences here?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think because I hadn't spent much time there and because I grew up nearby, probably not so many preconceptions. So I grew up not too far from Lawrence and Lowell, and knew something about the industrial history and how things had changed, also how things had been gentrified since, and so on. So I do recall talking to people in the area about the main street, and as with other areas, sometimes main streets would be challenged by malls being put up out by the highway, and so on. So that's kind of a familiar discussion. And I think on the other side of things, I've become interested in cities and towns that might have surprising backgrounds. You know, we might find, again, it depends on what you know. If you're a historian, you won't be surprised. But I lived briefly in Erie, Pennsylvania, and there was a concert hall or even opera house there that had turned into a movie theater. Sydney, Nova Scotia, which I visited, has this really interesting history from the early 20th century where there was also an opera house. A lot of these seem to turn into movie theaters. So the same goes for Fitchburg, that there was a lot happening there that I guess with my own understanding before I learned more, I wouldn't have thought it would be possible, you know, in terms of technology and travel and finances and so on. So to think of smaller cities which were at various times, say late 19th century, really active was really fascinating to start to learn about.
So you incorporated some pieces that you discovered in the Historical Society archives as well into, you know, your larger work. Could you talk about those a little bit?
Sure. There were many more than I could incorporate, but there's a handful that I chose to work with and sort of weave in as a patchwork. There was so much music that I ran across. I don't want to say discovered because it was there. And I could not incorporate everything I was interested in. There were many concerts and pieces and books to be written about the music of Fitchburg. But there were several that caught my attention. My conceit was to imagine a historical progression. So the piece begins without any references to Fitchburg's music, with the idea of the glaciers and the Nashua River. And then the first kind of sample, if you will, that appears is a hymn tune called Adieu that was published in 1796. And that really fascinated me. It's a modal hymn. It has words, but the words are not in my piece. And it came from a volume in the Historical Society called Universal Harmony, or Universal Collection of Sacred Music, and it was published in Charlestown, Massachusetts in 1796. Part of what interested me in finding this tune, besides the tune itself, was that the owners of this copy of the hymnal who lived in Fitchburg had checked off this particular hymn, made a check mark because they wanted to practice that one. So I liked the idea that that was present in Fitchburg and was almost certainly heard there in the past. So that one really interested me. I would like to do more with that tune. And it had its own, it was published with harmony that was kind of unfamiliar to me, but I worked out my own harmonies to the tune. the second example is a mashup of two polkas by Andrew Whitney. One is called the Fitchburg Polka and one is the Rollstone Polka. Something I found intriguing and delightful about those two polkas is they're very similar. They're almost inversions of one another at times. So I sort of mixed them up and had them play with one another, the two polkas.
Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about Andrew Whitney. Was he
Right
local to Fitchburg?
Yes, Andrew Whitney was very well known in Fitchburg, and I believe still is. His dates are 1826 or 27. I've seen different records, until 1912. So he was living in Fitchburg through the 19th century in the second half, where there would have been a lot of building industry and so on. He was known as an organist, organ builder, and as, of course, composer of polkas, among other things, and was responsible for the Opera House, which opened in 1880. One of the things that interested me in terms of my historical conceit was to think of how he was situated in that time period, in that some of the earlier music I looked at in the archives was handwritten, and then there's maybe some early publication. By the time we get to Andrew Whitney, there's actual commercial publication of this music. And in addition, the polkas are written, and even some marches at that time are published for piano, which gives a suggestion of something else that might have been happening in that time period, which is that having a piano in the home was getting to be more common. And so on the one hand, we have maybe earlier on even more of a regional kind of consciousness. Some of the hymn tunes I mentioned would be named after the places where they would be performed or sung in worship, not performed necessarily. And then by the time we get to Andrew Whitney, there's still a regional focus in terms of calling something the Rollstone Polka, but you can sense that there's a wider musical industry happening, and including the publishing industry. And he wrote an autobiography that I looked at while I was writing my piece. I found it really delightful. If I understand correctly, a historian could correct me on this if need be. He wrote his autobiography in the third person. So at the beginning of the publication, it begins with a note from him, like a preface saying, people have asked me to talk about my life and so on. But then when the actual document starts, it's in the third person. So there's a bit I can read that gives a sense of his character and something that he experienced while he was living in Fitchburg and working as an organist in the church. So apparently what happened is he was the organist for the church and expected to be continuing this work, but was not renewed. And the position was given to the deacon's son. And so this, I will now quote from Andrew Whitney's autobiography. On investigating the cause of this unexpected change of sentiment, it was found that Andrew Whitney had offended those in power by the so-called frivolity of his interludes, which he interpolated between the stanzas of a hymn, and as he extemporized them, introduced turns and trills. Moreover, his voluntaries were seldom played as they were written, for in performing them, he let his musical nature have free rein, and they were transmuted into worldly measures. As one lady of the congregation complained, they had quite a swing, which made them, according to the opinion of some, undevotional.
So yeah, a few too many liberties at the organ bench during the service, apparently.
Exactly. And there's another example from the hymn that I mentioned that relates to that. In Doris Kirkpatrick's book, The City and the River, she writes about a time of religious strife in the region, and specifically late 18th century. So speaking kind of generally about 100 years earlier. And there were arguments about how music should be performed, whether the deacon would perform a phrase solo and be answered by the congregation or not. And according to Kirkpatrick, she says that at that time, the entire congregation singing together was deemed irreligious and unscriptural. So we can see over the course of 100 years, similar discussions about the proper way of worshiping through music in church. And then, of course, at the time that Andrew Whitney was making his music in Fitchburg, the entertainment industry was more commercial and growing and so on. So it would have affected that issue at that time.
Well, Fitchburg certainly has a large number of church buildings. Some of them are ethnic oriented. Various ethnicities had their own churches. And a lot of those buildings now are not in use, which is very sad because there is an enormous amount of architectural history involved in looking at those buildings. And you can see which ones have been here a very long time and which ones probably sprouted up around the industry that made Fitchburg prosperous at the time as well. I don't doubt, though, that Andrew Whitney probably could have gotten another organ job in town with as many churches as were present.
That comment spurs a question, which is, whether at that time a musician would have performed only in their own congregation or not. I don't know what the tradition would have been.
That is a great question, and probably one that bears some research.
Thank you for joining us for I Remember When with the Fitchburg Historical Society. This is Susan Navarre, Executive Director. Please join us next week when we will continue with Fitchburg's musical history, including an opportunity to hear Barbara White's entire composition, Raging River, Rolling Stone, written in 2000 for the city of Fitchburg. To get in touch with us, please consider dropping us a line at welcome@fitchburghistoricalsociety.com, or you could even send us a letter at P.O. Box 953, Fitchburg, Massachusetts 01420,